Maddy and Anand join us now. We have the pleasure of doing this podcast in 4 different locations. Maddy, I'll start with you. Where are you? And then Anand, can you just let us know where you are as well?
So I am in North London in my flat.
I'm in Oxford at the same bleeding desk I've been at since March.
How has working from home been treating you both?
I think we were lucky. We were able to go into the office for a little bit across August and September, which I have to say was quite a nice change of scene for me. Yeah. It is getting a bit frustrating looking at the same 4 walls.
What about you, Anand?
Well, I never thought I'd say this, but I miss the people I work with.
Dan and I feel the same way.
Yeah, we do. I don't have to do my hair. That's the main thing. There's the main advantage of not having to go into the office. Should we talk about Brexit?
Yeah, which is what we've got these 2 very, very clever people here for. I'm going to start with the obvious question, and it's the question that everyone is asking whenever I speak to anyone when it comes to Brexit. With weeks to go until the Brexit deadline, we've seen high-level meetings take place in the last few weeks or so. The Prime Minister going to meet with the President of the European Commission. Maddy, I'll start with you first. Do you think we'll get a trade deal sorted in time? We've only got a few weeks left now.
So I think that, to be honest, I think it always was going to come down to this point. I don't think politically there was the sort of motivation on either side to get a deal earlier in the year. We know that compromise is still needed to reach that point. I do think that it feels like over the last couple of weeks there's a little bit more momentum, and it feels like more positive noises are coming out. So I am cautiously optimistic, but as I'm sure we'll get into, there are still some quite big stumbling blocks. And it's worth saying that even if a deal is reached, I don't think it's necessarily going to sort of cover everything where the UK and the EU might want to cooperate in the future. So I think we are, as we've been using the phrase this entire year, looking at more of a bare bones deal at this stage, and then probably looking at negotiations continuing beyond the end of the year.
What about you, Anand? Do you think we're going to get something sorted out in the next few weeks?
I mean, the honest truth is I don't know. But what I'd say, though, is because both sides would far prefer a deal to not getting a deal, I tend to think they'll find a way of getting something on paper and signing it and calling it a trade deal, whatever in fact it is.
You talked, Maddy, there about the stumbling blocks. Let's get into that, shall we? We know from the call that Boris Johnson had with Ursula von der Leyen over the last weekend, that they stated that some progress had been made, but the stumbling blocks essentially remain on fisheries and level playing field. And talk us through what we're talking about here then. Obviously, EU access to fishing waters is a big thing for the UK, and the whole level playing field argument we've heard from the start. Put it in as layman's terms as much as you possibly can. What are the sticking points for both sides on those issues?
Well, fisheries, as you say, is partly about EU access, but it's important not to forget that we depend on the EU as a market as well. So whilst you don't hear this very much in this country, there is an almost sort of perfect interdependence when it comes to fisheries, simply because we import what we eat and we export what we catch. So actually, both sides have an interest in striking some sort of agreement, but the politics is crucial. On the French side, for instance, President Macron wants to give his fishermen as much access to our markets as possible. On the British side, part of the point of Brexit for fishing communities was to have more of that catch themselves. I think a compromise is possible. It'll require both sides to move a little bit, but I don't think actually fisheries is the biggest issue we face. For me, the biggest issue is state aid rather than level playing field. Level playing field, I think you have these discussions in all trade deals, and there are ways of fixing a situation in which we commit to certain standards short of us signing up to EU law and giving the EU the right to retaliate if we're seen to go beyond their standards or below their standards. State aid, I just don't know. There are lots of signals from number 10 that this is a government that wants the freedom to be able to spend money as and when it likes without having to check with anyone first. On the other hand, it would be a curiosity if a Conservative government didn't sign a trade deal because it wanted to subsidise business to a very significant scale. So someone's going to have to give on state aid. I just at the moment can't see which side will.
This is where we keep talking about the sort of landing zone on state aid, where the EU originally said the UK should just keep pace with EU law and still have that oversight from EU institutions. Now it seems that really what they're saying is, look, just tell us what you're going to do with your subsidy regime, which this government has so far been quite reluctant to. And I think that focusing on where the domestic benefit can be, I think maybe the sort of best approach if this government is going to say this is actually what we're going to do. I mean, I completely agree with Anand that it does feel quite strange that it's a Conservative government that is so opposed to having a clearer sort of approach to this, and actually a clear logic and reason for why they're going to subsidise businesses, but also having that sort of oversight role.
What's your instinct on why the Tory government is being so reluctant on this, on state aid? You talk then it's odd for a Conservative government to be behaving in this way on this sort of side of the fence with state aid. So why, either of you, what do you think that is? Why that is that?
My view is it feels like it's just that this government doesn't want to be tied down in any way. So they sort of don't want to commit to something now that maybe in 2 years' time will make life difficult for them. And it feels to me that there's still quite a big question mark about actually what the future of the UK looks like outside of the EU. You know, we might have taken back control, but it's still not quite clear what this government plans to do with it. And to my mind, it feels a bit like they just don't want to sign up to anything that might cause headaches later down the line.
I mean, I agree, absolutely. I mean, taking back control, it turns out, was what Number 10 wants to do. It's not a question of the country. Number 10 doesn't want to be constrained, whether it's by courts, whether it's by Parliament, whether it's by EU law. And for me, actually, it's as much about that, the desire to free yourself from constraint, as it is about any practical policy agenda that the government might have. And we see this not just with state aid, we see it with regulation as well. We're going to keep our standards high. We just don't want you to be in a position to tell us what our standards should be, has been a common refrain through these negotiations. And now we see exactly the same thing with state aid. I cannot see in the fiscal climate we're going to be in as we enter next year, this government spending as much as, say, the German government does. So, I mean, it'll be a very interesting question in 4 years' time, looking back to see what is it we have done that we could not have done had we been either a member or within the single market or whatever, because I'm not sure there'll be all that much.
The focus on Brexit has sort of been diverted away, as you would expect when there's a international pandemic, and we are all focusing on that. But in recent months and weeks or so, we all started to talk about the internal markets bill again, and it felt like we'd gone back in time and all the news was focused on Brexit. A lot of the focus was on the UK potentially breaking international law. We've heard that the EU is putting the UK on notice. How much of an impact do you both think that's had on the negotiations? Was that just brinkmanship? Was it the UK and the EU just playing their negotiating hands? Or how serious of an issue do you think that could be in the coming weeks? We'll go to Maddy first.
I mean, clearly there was a concern from the UK government about quite what they'd signed up to under the withdrawal agreement and what it might mean for trade between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. It's worth saying that one of the clauses in the bill would have removed the need for exit summary declarations for goods moving from Northern Ireland to Great Britain. And this is sort of this idea of unfettered access is something that the government previously committed to. Having said that, obviously, by including these clauses saying that they would be willing to break the sort of treaty that they signed up to last year, clearly did raise some big concerns in the EU. We did see quite a significant international response to it. I do think it's interesting that we've sort of now seen that the government is saying it won't move the internal market bill to the Lords until after the European Council. So they sort of delayed the progress there because they clearly did see actually maybe we did slightly overplay our hand here, and we maybe didn't quite anticipate the international response, particularly to what the government sort of planned to do. The EU, as you say, has launched infringement proceedings, as you'd expect, given that the government has said it would consider breaking the law. I think that what's interesting is that since then there has been more warm words, I guess, around the idea of reaching a deal. I don't think it's because the government included these provisions in the bill. I don't think that it was necessarily a good negotiating tactic. I think the main thing to say is it hasn't undermined the negotiating tactic. And as you say, it has drawn attention back to Brexit. So I think at this stage, I don't see it as entirely damaging. Having said that, if there is the prospect of a deal, I think the government is going to have to remove those clauses because fully implementing the withdrawal agreement and what it signed up to last year is one of the big conditions for reaching a deal with the EU. I mean,
I agree with that. I don't think actually that this has had much impact at all on the Brexit talks per se. I think actually the negotiations in the Joint Committee, the negotiations on Brexit continue as before. For me, increasingly looking at the internal market bill, it was about internal signalling as much as anything else. I think Boris Johnson had to have an enormous bust-up with the European Union, if only to prove he wasn't Theresa May. And in a sense, there are slight shades of prorogation here for me, which is you do something that a lot of people in the bubble think is totally outrageous. Its practical import going forward might be relatively limited, but you've put down a mark. You've said, OK, look, I'm willing to do whatever it takes. And I think the fact of having done this, I think the hope in number 10 is it makes it easier to sell whatever is agreed with the European Union, because you can't doubt Boris Johnson's bona fides because he's willing to even talk about breaching international law to get what he wants. So this, for me, is a lot of signalling aimed primarily to a domestic audience. But I don't think, I mean, to say it's reduced EU trust in the UK implies that the EU had loads of trust in Boris Johnson to start with, and I'm not sure they did.
On that, you mentioned sort of Tory MPs and then kind of internal signalling. We've seen in the last few days sort of Nigel Farage and other Brexit Party figures say they'll come back into the fray if they start to notice this Brexit deal not living up to the promises that they believe the Prime Minister made on it. How conscious will the Prime Minister be of his own party? He's in a different position now, having an enormous majority. But when he goes into these intensive talks, when David Frost and Barnier meet again soon, how much will the government be aware of giving in too much on the issues we've talked about, given right now his party, his backbenchers aren't particularly happy with him over coronavirus either?
I mean, there's several bits to that. I mean, for me, the macro issue here is what the government can't afford is for the Leave coalition to splinter into two, because it was by uniting the Leave coalition that the Tories got the majority they got last December. There's no guarantee, I don't think, that even if some on his backbenchers, some of the Brexit ultras talk about betrayal, that the public at large are going to be bothered because there's a tiny element of EU law that still hangs over our heads. I mean, it's hard to say what our politics will look like going forward. I'm not utterly convinced that Nigel Farage will have the room with a slightly softer Brexit deal than he had in 2019 in the European elections, when the question was, they said we'd leave and we haven't. That was quite clear cut. So I'm not convinced about the Farage threat, nor am I wholly convinced about the backbenchers, because I simply don't think there are enough of them who are Brexit ultras to make an enormous difference. I think the coalition that's been assembled on COVID doesn't just include libertarians. It also includes people who are genuinely worried about Parliament's rights and duties when it comes to legislation. And those aren't people who would necessarily be motivated to rebel against the government just because the Brexit deal wasn't absolutely perfect. So I think the government has got more wiggle room than you imply. Whether or not the government itself realises that and wants to take the risk is a different question. But I suspect they're going to have to ward off some criticism from their backbenchers, and they've probably decided they've got the numbers to do it. Remember, of course, Parliament doesn't actually get a vote on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Thoughts on that, Maddy? Or...
Yeah, I pretty much agree with everything Anand just said. And I think sort of coming back to something that he said earlier in the conversation about the sort of politics from both sides of actually just wanting a deal. And I think that probably plays out for MPs as well, in terms of thinking about their constituents, where if they sort of kick up so much of a fuss that they can actually hold up the talks. And I agree that there isn't a vote on a deal, but there is a chance they'll need to pass primary legislation to implement it. It's not entirely clear what sort of deal would need actually primary legislation to do so. There are some powers the government already has, but it might mean that they do need to do something in the House. But I think that the pressure from the country and actually just being able to say the Conservative Party sort of got things done, there is a deal at the end of the year, we're able to leave the EU or leave the transition period, smoothly. I think the politics of that become quite important for quite a lot of Conservative MPs, not just for the Prime Minister.
You've got to think about the alternative too. In the event of no deal, it will be relatively easy for Labour to extend its criticism of the Prime Minister's competence to Brexit as well. He can't even get a Brexit deal, and he said we had one ready. It's a very easy attack line. So I think politically you've got to weigh that against the danger that 15 or 20 Tory MPs will be less than happy. And I suspect that the danger of giving Labour ammunition is a greater one.
We've been speaking about this issue now for 4 years, and the one thing that we've always said is how united the European side always seemed to be compared to the kind of the UK government, and how what a mess it was over here compared to over there. Is that still the case? Are European leaders still as united on this kind of behind the scenes as they appear to have been publicly for the last 4 years, or are there kind of in divisions over things like fisheries? I mean, I've read over the weekend that Macron may be pushing a bit too hard on fisheries for some European leaders who have kind of no skin in the game on that one.
I was going to say, I mean, with the future relationship, I think you are looking at sort of a different set of issues, because it is broader. It is covering sort of the future trading economic relationship between the UK and the EU, as well as the future security relationship. So I think there's sort of more opportunity to have difference of opinion, or at least different priorities. So, for example, there are concerns around social security in a lot of the Eastern European member states. And as you mentioned, there are some member states which are more concerned about fish, so France, Denmark, to name a couple. And I think that there is a bit more nuance to the EU side, but I also think, and I'd be quite interested in Anand's view on this, is that I think also a lot of them just want this done. And I think that there is still also a main motivation to actually get some kind of deal. And I do think that ultimately, as we have seen throughout this process, the EU does have more leverage. So I completely agree that if you're getting to a point where the European Parliament are voting on it, it's probably because the UK has made concessions. And we haven't really seen any sign of a divided European side, particularly, as I say, there's discussion about certain member states caring about some of the issues more. And obviously there will have to be some kind of compromise there. But I don't feel like, I mean, essentially the UK just isn't asking for that much. So I don't think we're seeing the sort of possible divide and conquer approach that we saw Theresa May try and carry out back during the withdrawal agreement negotiations. And I should say try and fail. But yeah, I'd be quite interested in Anand's view on that as well.
The way I'd put it is they're united, but they don't agree. Which is to say, yeah, if you passed this, if you went into detail, if you went to every one of the 27 capitals and said, what do you think we should be doing with the UK, they'd all come up with a slightly different position. I mean, for the Germans, the notion that trade in automobiles is going to be hampered because of French fishermen is nothing short of barking mad. But the reason why they're united is this simply isn't important enough anymore for them. They have real serious fights to have over the budget, over rule of law in the European Union, over all sorts of issues, which for them are far more important than Brexit. And I think what's happened amongst EU member states is they've decided that because this is a second, third, or even fourth order issue, no one wants to burn their political capital by speaking out about this. They're just going to put up with it and deal with it, which will give, the ability to, they're going to use their political capital on the things that really matter to them, which might be the details of this enormous EU budget, which ultimately is going to impact on all of them a huge amount. So I think it's not to say they all think exactly the same thing. It's just that no member state thinks it is worth risking the appearance of EU unity over.
Final question, because we've been talking for ages, and as Anand said earlier, he could talk forever on this. This and Leeds United, his two favourite topics. When we met back in, or when was it, start of the year now, when we all met in person, remember those heady days? And I think we discussed the idea of by December, the deadline, there could potentially be a sort of the bones of a deal that we then sort of build on as time goes on. So it's not all done and dusted. If I was to ask you both a prediction on what we think, where we'll think we'll end up in a few weeks' time, is that something you maybe think we're going to be heading towards, where we have some kind of deal, it's kind of a skeleton deal that we build on over time? Is that where we're heading towards, or do you think that's not the case anymore?
I think basically, yeah, I think that is probably where we're headed. I think we weren't expecting to see movement till this point anyway, because of the politics. I think that, I'd be quite surprised if suddenly a sort of very comprehensive trade agreement was sort of pulled out of a back pocket. I might be proved wrong. So I guess I'm slightly staking my reputation on that. But I think that...
Hedging your bets.
Yeah, hedging my bets. I might regret saying that shortly. But it does feel like sort of some of the key issues. So basically trading goods is the main thing that I think we're likely to see something on. So around tariffs and quotas, removing tariffs and quotas from trade, trading goods and something on sort of social security, something on fish, they're going to have to. I think that, and probably on some of the transport issues as well. I think that what will be interesting then to see is what happens in some of those areas where they haven't agreed yet. Are there going to be some kind of bridging arrangements while negotiations continue? That would require negotiation. Or will we see the UK and the EU sort of take unilateral measures to try and sort of find more time while they negotiate them? The other interesting question is whether or not, even with the sort of bare bones trade agreement, whether there is some kind of implementation phase so businesses can actually adjust to those changes. So we haven't discussed at all sort of what that changing relationship with the EU actually means in terms of preparing for the end of the year. We know there's still a huge amount of uncertainty about where the negotiations will land. So it'll be quite interesting to see whether the two sides do try and buy a bit more time for businesses to actually adjust to the detail of any future trading relationship.
There's a couple of things to say about this, I suppose. Firstly, for me, one of the biggest differences between deal and no deal is that deal keeps the two sides talking and getting on. I think under no deal, you end up in this process of mutual acrimony and finger pointing that will make it very hard for us to discuss anything with European partners for months. So getting a deal, however thin that deal is, and I agree with what Maddy said, that I think we're going to end up with a relatively bare bones free trade agreement that covers elements, but not all of goods trade, and very, very little else. That allows us to keep talking if we need to. The one thing I would say is under this government, and if you think back to sort of early in the pandemic when the government declined to participate in joint procurement initiatives, I think this government is politically allergic to being seen to be working with the European Union unless they absolutely have to. So I'm not sure how much there will be in the way of continued negotiations under Boris Johnson. But I think if we end up with a relatively thin free trade deal, then the next 15 to 20 years, we are going to be talking to the European Union about elements of cooperation and how we improve them. We're going to feel a little bit Swiss. This is going to be an ongoing discussion simply because the EU is our nearest neighbour and our largest neighbour, and therefore relations with them will continually be under review.
Maddy, Anand, thank you so much for your time. That was an incredibly insightful discussion. I'm almost certain we'll have you both on very soon as we try and unpick what happens in the next few months or so.
Well, the next time Liverpool concede 7, I'm happy to come back on.